Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon watching the stars drift by through the main screen. His ship was 3 weeks into a routine survey mission near the edge of human space, and everything had been quiet until now. "Doctor." Lisa Grant looked up from her science station with worry in her eyes and called him over to see what she had found. The signal was weak and broken, but it was clearly not human. Lisa worked her controls trying to clean up the transmission while Communications Officer Amy Rodriguez helped boost the signal strength. After 20 minutes of work, they managed to get a clear message, and what they heard made everyone on the bridge go silent. The voice belonged to a Zephyrian, and Jake knew that meant trouble. The Zephyrians were one of the oldest races in the galaxy, and they never asked anyone for help. They had technology that made human ships look like toys, and their civilization had been peaceful for thousands of years. But now one of them was sending out a distress call that reached across half the galaxy. Ambassador Kethval of the Zephyrian Republic spoke in perfect English, though his voice shook with fear. He told them about an ancient enemy that had awakened from deep space. The Void Swarm had returned after sleeping for 1,000,000 years, and they were destroying everything in their path. 12 Zephyrian worlds had already fallen, and their capital planet would be next. Jake listened as the ambassador described the enemy. The Void Swarm was made up of machines that could think and learn. They ate entire star systems to make themselves stronger, and they adapted to any weapon used against them. The Zephyrian fleet had fought them for months, but every battle made the machines smarter and harder to kill. What shocked Jake most was what came next. The Zephyrians were asking Earth for help. They had studied human military history and believed that humans fought differently than other races. Where most species followed honor codes and traditional tactics, humans would do anything to win. The ambassador said this might be the only way to stop the swarm. Commander Ben Clark stepped forward and asked how long they had. The answer was not good. Zephyr Prime had maybe 5 days before the swarm arrived. The planet held billions of civilians, and if it fell, the entire Zephyrian civilization would end. Jake knew they had to get this message to Earth as fast as possible. Amy worked her station and sent an emergency transmission to Fleet Command while Jake ordered the ship to turn around. The Horizon jumped to hyperspace, heading for Earth at maximum speed. During the long journey home, Lisa studied every piece of data the Zephyrians had sent about their enemy. The information painted a terrifying picture. The Void Swarm ships were massive and covered in armor that could repair itself. Their weapons cut through shields like they were not there, and they moved faster than anything should be able to move. But the worst part was how they learned from every fight. Lisa showed Jake recordings of battles between Zephyrian ships and the Swarm. In the first fights, the aliens had some success using their advanced energy weapons. But by the third battle, the Swarm had adapted, and the same weapons barely scratched them. By the 10th battle, the Swarm was winning every engagement. Ben studied the tactical data and found something interesting. The Swarm seemed to expect certain types of attacks based on what other races had used against them in the past. They adapted quickly to energy weapons and missiles, but there were gaps in their defenses that suggested they had never faced certain types of warfare. Jake called a meeting in the ship's briefing room, and his senior officers gathered around the table. Lisa presented her analysis while Ben talked about possible weaknesses. Amy had been in contact with other human ships and learned that similar distress calls were reaching Earth from multiple directions. The Swarm was not just attacking the Zephyrians. Reports were coming in from across the galaxy about worlds going dark and civilizations sending out final messages before their star systems went silent. The ancient machines were waking up everywhere, and no one seemed able to stop them. Jake looked at the star charts and realized the scope of the crisis. The Swarm was not attacking randomly. They were moving in a pattern that would let them consume the most advanced civilizations first. Earth was not their main target yet, but if they succeeded in destroying the older races, then humanity would be next. The Horizon dropped out of hyperspace near Earth 3 days later, and Jake immediately requested priority communications with Fleet Command. Admiral Patricia Hayes appeared on screen within minutes, and Jake could see she already knew about the crisis. Emergency meetings had been going on for days, and the entire Earth Defense Force was mobilizing. Jake transmitted all the data they had collected while Lisa explained her findings about swarm adaptation. Admiral Hayes listened carefully and asked detailed questions about Zephyrian tactics and technology. When they were done, she told Jake that President Charles Weber had already authorized something called Project Deep Strike. The project was classified above Jake's level, but the Admiral said it involved weapons and strategies that Earth had been developing in secret for decades. Human military planners had always assumed they might face superior alien technology someday, and they had prepared accordingly. Ben asked about the timeline, and Hayes confirmed their worst fears. The swarm would reach Zephyr Prime in less than 48 hours, and Earth's response fleet would not be ready for at least a week. Even if they could save the Zephyrian capital, the damage to galactic civilization would be enormous. Jake volunteered the Horizon for immediate deployment, but Hayes had other plans. She wanted him to return to Zephyrian space as Earth's official representative and coordinate with surviving alien fleets. His ship would be upgraded with experimental weapons that had never been tested in real combat. As Jake prepared to leave Earth orbit, he watched the massive mobilization taking place around him. Hundreds of ships were being retrofitted with new weapons, while thousands more were being pulled out of mothballs and returned to service. Construction yards that had been quiet for years were now working around the clock. Lisa received additional data from Earth's xenobiology department about machine psychology and adaptation patterns. The information suggested that the swarm's greatest strength might also be its weakness. Their ability to adapt to known threats could be overwhelmed if they faced too many unknown variables at once. Amy established contact with surviving Zephyrian ships and learned that their fleet was down to less than 20% of its original strength. The remaining ships were falling back toward their homeworld, but they would not be able to defend it for long. Time was running out for everyone. Jake gave the order to jump back towards Zephyrian space, knowing that Earth's fate might depend on what happened in the next few days. The Horizon had gone from a simple exploration ship to humanity's first line of defense against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations for millions of years. Behind them, Earth continued its frantic preparations, while ahead of them an ancient evil moved toward its next target. Jake could only hope that human ingenuity and determination would be enough to stop something that had never been stopped before. The galaxy was about to learn what humans could do when their backs were against the wall. Admiral Patricia Hayes stood in the war room deep beneath Fleet Command headquarters, watching as streams of data filled the screens around her. The Zephyrian distress calls had been coming in for 6 hours, and each one painted a worse picture than the last. She had called an emergency meeting of the Global Defense Council, and now the most powerful people on Earth were gathering to decide humanity's response. President Charles Weber arrived first, followed by General Susan Carter, who commanded all ground forces, and Dr. Kevin Stone from the Advanced Weapons Division. Defense Secretary Robert Kane came in last, carrying a briefcase that contained the authorization codes for Project Deep Strike. Hayes had been waiting 20 years to open those files. The president took his seat at the head of the table and asked for a full briefing. Hayes activated the main display and showed them recordings from the Zephyrian battles. The alien ships were beautiful and graceful, with technology far beyond anything humans had built, but they died just as easily as any other ship when the Void Swarm found them. Dr. Stone leaned forward as he watched the swarm vessels move across the screen. Their design was unlike anything in the galactic databases, with hulls that seemed to shift and change as they fought. The machines learned from every weapon that hit them and adapted their defenses in real time. It was like fighting an enemy that got stronger with every punch. General Carter studied the tactical data and shook her head. The Zephyrians were using standard fleet formations and conventional weapons, which played right into the swarm's adaptation protocols. She could see why they were losing so badly. Their honor-based military doctrine made them predictable, and the machines were taking advantage of that. President Weber asked the question everyone was thinking: could Earth's military do any better against an enemy that had defeated civilizations millions of years more advanced than humanity? Hayes smiled and told him about the files she had been keeping secret since the day she took command project. Deep Strike had begun 30 years ago when Earth first made contact with alien civilizations. Military planners realized that human technology was primitive compared to what existed in the galaxy, and they started developing weapons and tactics that assumed they would always be. Outgunned and outnumbered Dr. Stone opened his briefcase and pulled out data chips containing designs that had never seen the light of day. Quantum destabilizer weapons that could phase through any known shield technology. Viral code packages designed to corrupt and destroy artificial intelligence systems. Kinetic bombardment platforms that turned asteroids into planet-killing weapons. The president looked through the files with growing amazement. Earth had been preparing for this kind of war since before most people knew aliens existed. Hayes explained that every human military officer above the rank of colonel had been briefed on asymmetric warfare tactics designed specifically for fighting superior technology. General Carter stood and activated another display showing troop deployment plans. While the fleet engaged the enemy in space, her soldiers would use experimental weapons and tactics to fight any swarm forces that made it to planetary surfaces. Her troops had trained for years to fight mechanical enemies using everything from electromagnetic pulse bombs to simple acid that could eat through metal. The key to the human strategy was unpredictability. Where other races followed military traditions that went back thousands of years, humans were willing to try anything that might work. They would use weapons that others considered dishonorable and tactics that seemed insane to more civilized species. Hayes brought up the fleet status reports and showed them the mobilization that was already underway. Every shipyard in the solar system was working to retrofit human vessels with the experimental technology. The process would take days that they did not have, but there was no choice. Captain Danny Foster appeared on the communication screen from his ship, the UES Defiance. He had volunteered to lead a reconnaissance mission to the front lines and gather intelligence on swarm tactics while helping evacuate civilians from threatened worlds. His ship was already fitted with prototype weapons and would serve as a test platform for human technology. Dr. Stone explained how the quantum destabilizers worked. Instead of trying to punch through swarm armor, the weapons would phase the target partially out of normal spacetime. The effect would bypass shields and armor entirely and destroy the target from the inside. The swarm could not adapt to something that did not actually hit them. Chief Engineer Maria Santos joined the meeting by video link from the main construction facility. She had teams working around the clock to produce the new weapons and modifications for both human and alien ships. Earth was sharing its technology with any species willing to fight. Alongside them, the president authorized the release of classified human military doctrine to allied alien commanders. Information that had been kept secret for decades would now be transmitted across the galaxy to anyone who would listen. Human tactics manuals were being translated into dozens of languages and sent to surviving fleet commanders. General Carter explained her ground combat strategy. Human soldiers would fight the swarm using close-quarters tactics that the machines had never encountered. Where other species relied on energy weapons and long-range combat, humans would get close and use improvised weapons that could not be predicted or adapted to. Hayes showed them the timeline for fleet deployment. The first human ships would reach Zephyrian space in 4 days, which might be too late to save their capital world. But even if Zephyr Prime fell, the human fleet would continue fighting and use every lesson learned to protect other worlds. Dr. Stone revealed the most dangerous weapon in their arsenal, a computer virus designed specifically to exploit the swarm's adaptation protocols. Instead of trying to destroy their systems directly, the virus would force them to continuously adapt to false threats until their processing power was overwhelmed, and they shut down. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent communication from Captain Foster. His ship had reached the outer edge of the crisis zone and was picking up refugees from a destroyed research station. The survivors were telling stories about swarm tactics that confirmed the worst fears about their intelligence and adaptability. Foster reported that the machines were not just destroying civilizations but studying them. They collected data about military capabilities and cultural weaknesses that they used to make their next attacks more effective. The swarm was learning about the galaxy's defenses and finding ways to overcome them. Hayes realized that time was running out faster than they had thought. If the swarm was studying galactic military doctrine, then they would eventually learn about human capabilities too. The element of surprise would not last long. Once the machines encountered human weapons and tactics, President Weber made the final decision to deploy Earth's entire military to the crisis zone. Every available ship would be sent to fight an enemy that had never been defeated in millions of years of existence. The fate of galactic civilization now rested on weapons and strategies that had never been tested in real combat. General Carter began issuing deployment orders while Dr. Stone supervised the final weapon installations. Chief Engineer Santos pushed her teams to work even faster, knowing that every hour of delay meant more worlds would fall to the swarm, the largest military mobilization in human history was beginning. Admiral Hayes took personal command of the fleet that would carry humanity's hopes into battle against an ancient evil. She knew that conventional tactics would fail against an enemy that adapted to everything. But humans had never been conventional, and that might be exactly what the galaxy needed. As the meeting ended, President Weber signed the orders that would commit Earth to a war it might not survive. But the alternative was watching civilizations fall one by one until humanity stood alone against an enemy that had consumed everything else in the galaxy. That was not an option any of them could accept. The war room emptied as military leaders rushed to implement plans that had been decades in the making. Earth's ultimate armada was about to face the greatest test in human history, and the outcome would determine whether organic life survived in a galaxy that was rapidly falling to ancient machines. Commander Tony Mitchell watched as the refugee ships limped into the human colony of New Geneva, carrying survivors from worlds that no longer existed. The aliens who stepped off those vessels had seen their entire civilizations destroyed in a matter of hours, and their stories painted a terrifying picture of the Void Swarm's capabilities. Dr. Helen Brooks set up medical stations to treat wounded refugees while also collecting data about swarm tactics from survivors. Each account added another piece to the puzzle of how the ancient machines operated and what might be done to stop them. The information was being transmitted back to Earth in real time. The Karathi Empire had sent Admiral Vexter to coordinate with human forces, and he arrived on New Geneva demanding to speak with whoever was in charge. The massive alien stood 3 meters tall, and his species had been warriors for 10,000 years. He did not believe that humans could teach his people anything about warfare. Captain Rachel Stone met with Admiral Vexler in the colony's main conference room and laid out human tactical proposals on the table. The Karathi officer looked at the plans with obvious disdain until Rachel showed him recordings of her recent raid on a swarm harvesting station where human-modified ships had penetrated defenses that had stopped Karathi dreadnoughts. The raid had been a complete success with human vessels using phase shift technology to bypass swarm shields and viral weapons to disable their targeting systems. Rachel's ship had destroyed 3 harvesting platforms and escaped without taking any damage. The Karathi admiral studied the recordings with growing interest. Vexler admitted that his people had lost dozens of ships trying to attack similar targets using conventional weapons and tactics. The swarm had adapted to Karathi energy weapons within hours, and their massive dreadnoughts had become easy targets for the machine fleet. He asked Rachel to explain how human ships had succeeded where his had failed. Rachel showed him the fundamental difference between human and alien military thinking, where the Karathi followed battle doctrines that emphasized honor and direct confrontation. Humans were willing to use any advantage they could find. Stealth attacks, hit and run tactics, and weapons that seemed cowardly to warrior races. The Karathi admiral was troubled by what he saw as dishonorable warfare, but he could not argue with the results. Rachel's ships had accomplished more in one raid than his entire fleet had managed in weeks of fighting. He agreed to let human advisors work with his commanders to develop new tactics. Dr. Brooks presented her analysis of swarm psychology to the mixed group of human and alien officers. The machines had been designed millions of years ago to fight conventional military forces using predictable tactics and weapons. They could adapt to known threats, but struggled with completely irrational or seemingly counterproductive behavior. Colonel Frank Turner established training camps where human military instructors taught alien soldiers guerrilla warfare techniques. The aliens struggled with concepts like acceptable losses and fighting dirty because their cultures had spent millennia developing honor-based military traditions that the swarm could easily predict and counter. The Zephyrian survivors provided detailed technical data about swarm adaptation protocols which Dr. Brooks used to develop countermeasures. She discovered that the machines had a processing limit that could be overwhelmed if they were forced to adapt to too many different threats. Simultaneously, Captain Steve Johnson arrived with the experimental stealth ship UES Ghostwalker and began working with alien engineers to retrofit their vessels with human cloaking technology. The process was difficult because alien ships had not been designed for stealth operations, but the modifications were essential for the guerrilla tactics humans wanted to use. Admiral Hayes arrived 2 days later with the advance elements of Earth's response fleet and immediately took command of the growing alliance. Ships from dozens of species were gathering at New Geneva, but they represented only a fraction of their original numbers. The swarm had already destroyed most of the galaxy's military capacity. Hayes called a strategy meeting with all surviving fleet commanders and laid out the human battle plan. Instead of trying to match the swarm's overwhelming firepower, they would use mobility and unpredictability to strike at vulnerable targets while avoiding direct confrontation with the main machine fleet. The alien commanders were skeptical of tactics that seemed to involve running away from fights, but Hayes showed them intelligence reports about swarm resource gathering operations. The machines needed to constantly harvest raw materials to build new ships, and if those operations could be disrupted, the swarm's expansion would slow. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy White presented plans for ground operations that would target swarm installations on planetary surfaces. Human Marines would use close-quarters combat techniques that the machines had never encountered because other species fought at long range. Using energy weapons, the Alliance fleet began practicing human tactics, using war games that simulated swarm encounters. Alien crews struggled with the constant changes in formation and the seemingly random attack patterns, but they began to understand how unpredictability could be used as a weapon. Dr. Stone arrived with the latest batch of experimental weapons, including the computer virus that could exploit swarm adaptation protocols. The virus had been tested against captured swarm technology and showed promising results, but it had never been used against active machine intelligence. Amy Rodriguez coordinated communications between the various species and worked to overcome language barriers that made tactical coordination difficult. She developed a simplified command system that allowed rapid deployment of mixed human and alien forces without confusion. Refugees continued to arrive carrying increasingly desperate reports about the swarm's advance toward major population centers. Zephyr Prime was still holding out, but barely, and other core worlds were sending distress calls as machine scouts appeared in their systems. Admiral Vexter worked with his human counterparts to modify Korathi dreadnoughts for guerrilla warfare operations. The massive ships had to be stripped of ceremonial armor and non-essential systems to make them fast enough for hit-and-run attacks. The changes violated every Korathi military tradition, but survival was more important than honor. Colonel Turner's training programs produced the first mixed human-alien units, capable of coordinating ground operations against mechanical enemies. The alien soldiers had learned to use improvised weapons and dirty fighting techniques that their species had abandoned thousands of years ago. Dr. Brooks made a breakthrough in understanding swarm command structure when she analyzed communication patterns between machine ships. The swarm used a hierarchical network that could be disrupted if key command nodes were destroyed, but identifying those nodes required getting close enough to scan their communication frequencies. Captain Johnson tested the Ghostwalker's stealth systems against simulated swarm sensors and confirmed that human cloaking technology could hide ships from machine detection systems. The discovery opened new possibilities for reconnaissance and surprise. Attacks that could gather intelligence about swarm weaknesses. The Alliance fleet reached full strength 3 days later with over 8,000 ships from 47 different species, all following human tactical doctrine. Admiral Hayes looked at the force under her command and realized that humanity had gone from being considered primitive newcomers to leading the galaxy's defense in less than a week. Time was running out as scout reports indicated that the main swarm fleet was moving toward its next target. Zephyr Prime would fall within hours unless the Alliance could intervene, and there were no guarantees that even human tactics would be enough to stop an enemy that had destroyed every civilization it had ever encountered. Hayes gave the order to jump toward Zephyrian space, knowing that the next few days would determine whether organic life survived in the galaxy. The Alliance fleet disappeared into hyperspace, carrying the hopes of billions of refugees and the untested weapons and tactics that represented their only chance against an ancient evil. The Alliance fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zephyr system and immediately faced a sight that made even veteran commanders pause in shock. The Void Swarm had assembled the largest space fleet anyone had ever seen, with thousands of mechanical warships surrounding the dying planet like a metal storm. Cloud Admiral Hayes studied the tactical display from the bridge of her flagship and realized that conventional battle plans would be suicide against such overwhelming numbers. The swarm ships were massive and covered in adaptive armor that had already learned to counter most known weapons. But humans had not come here to fight conventionally. Captain Steve Johnson took the Ghost Walker on a reconnaissance run through the outer edge of the swarm formation using stealth systems to avoid detection. His scans revealed that the machine fleet was organized around massive command vessels that coordinated the smaller ships through quantum communication links. The first phase of the human strategy began with Captain Danny Foster leading a strike force of fast attack ships against swarm resource gatherers operating in the asteroid belt. Instead of engaging the main fleet, the human ships targeted support vessels that the machines needed to maintain their war effort. Foster's ships used hit-and-run tactics that prevented the swarm from adapting to their attack patterns. The human vessels would strike quickly using quantum destabilizer weapons, then jump away before the machines could respond. Each attack destroyed valuable resources while avoiding direct confrontation with swarm warships. The machine fleet began repositioning to protect their resource operations, but this created gaps in their formation around Zephyr Prime. Admiral Hayes ordered the second phase to begin with mixed human and alien squadrons exploiting these openings to evacuate civilians from the planet's surface. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy White led the first ground assault on Zephyr Prime itself, where swarm harvesting machines were stripping the planet of raw materials. Her Marines landed in drop pods and immediately engaged the mechanical ground forces. Using close-quarters combat techniques, the swarm ground units had adapted to energy weapons and explosive devices used by other species, but they struggled against human tactics like hand-to-hand combat and improvised weapons. White soldiers used everything from combat knives to makeshift clubs to destroy machines that had been designed to fight high-tech warfare. Dr. Helen Brooks coordinated the deployment of the computer virus from a secure position aboard Admiral Hayes' flagship. The virus was transmitted through captured swarm communication frequencies and began infiltrating machine networks across the entire fleet. The virus worked by forcing the swarm's adaptation protocols to respond to false threats that did not actually exist. Machine ships began modifying their systems to counter weapons that were never fired and defenses that were never deployed. The constant adaptation cycles overloaded their processing capacity. Captain Rachel Stone led a daring assault on one of the swarm command vessels using modified Korathi dreadnoughts that had been stripped down for speed and stealth. The alien ships followed human tactical doctrine for the first time in their history and successfully penetrated the machine formation. The assault on the command vessel revealed the true scope of swarm intelligence when Stone's boarding parties encountered machine intelligences that had been absorbing knowledge from destroyed civilizations for millions of years. The machines knew everything about galactic military history except how humans fought Admiral Vexter. overcame thousands of years of warrior tradition and ordered his remaining dreadnoughts to retreat when they came under heavy fire instead of standing and fighting. The tactical withdrawal confused the swarm targeting systems which had been programmed to expect Korathi ships to fight to the death. Dr. Lisa Grant discovered that the swarm's central intelligence was located aboard a massive vessel at the heart of their formation. Destroying that ship would cause the remaining machines to revert to individual programming without the coordination that made them so dangerous. The battle reached its climax when Admiral Hayes ordered every ship in the Alliance fleet to execute a coordinated attack pattern that used misdirection and sacrifice plays to create openings for decisive strikes. Human captains volunteered for suicide runs that served as distractions while the main force moved into position. Captain Jake Morrison brought the horizon in close to the swarm command ship using a dangerous hyperspace jump that materialized his vessel inside the machine formation. His ship took massive damage but succeeded in deploying a quantum destabilizer directly against the command vessel's core. The destruction of the central intelligence sent shock waves through the swarm network. As millions of machine ships suddenly lost coordination, some continued fighting independently while others simply stopped moving as their command protocols failed. Colonel Frank Turner's mixed species ground forces fought their way through disabled swarm installations on Zephyr Prime, rescuing civilians who had been trapped in the mechanical harvesting complexes. The close-quarters fighting continued for hours as human and alien soldiers cleared the planet sector by sector. Amy Rodriguez coordinated the massive rescue operation as transport ships moved through the chaos of the collapsing swarm formation. To evacuate survivors from Zephyr Prime, the communications networks were overloaded with distress calls and coordination requests, but somehow the evacuation succeeded. The remaining swarm ships began a fighting withdrawal from the system, but they were no longer the perfectly coordinated force that had terrorized the galaxy. Without their central intelligence, the machines reverted to simpler programming that made them vulnerable to conventional tactics. Admiral Hayes watched from her damaged bridge as the Alliance fleet pursued the retreating swarm forces and realized that they had achieved something nobody thought possible. The ancient enemy had been defeated not through superior technology but through human determination and tactical flexibility. The cost of victory was enormous, with nearly 40% of the Alliance fleet destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Hundreds of ships had been sacrificed to create the openings needed for the final assault, and thousands of brave souls had given their lives to save Zephyr Prime. Captain Johnson used the Ghost Walker to hunt down scattered swarm fragments that were trying to escape the system. The remaining machines were dangerous, but without coordination they could be defeated by conventional forces using the tactics that humans had taught their alien allies. Dr. Brooks analyzed the wreckage of destroyed swarm vessels and discovered technology that was millions of years more advanced than anything in the galaxy. The machines had been collecting and improving technology from every civilization they destroyed, creating a technological treasure trove. The Battle of Zephyr Prime ended when the last swarm command node was destroyed by a combined human and Korathi strike force. The remaining machine ships powered down as their network collapsed, leaving thousands of disabled vessels drifting through space. Admiral Hayes transmitted a victory message to Earth and the surviving worlds of the galaxy, announcing that the Void Swarm had been stopped. But she knew the war was far from over, as intelligence reports indicated that other swarm fleets were still active in distant parts of the galaxy. The Alliance had proven that the ancient enemy could be defeated, but it would require continued cooperation between species and the adoption of human military doctrine that many civilizations found difficult to accept. The galaxy had been saved, but at the cost of everything many species believed about honorable warfare. Zephyr Prime was safe, but scarred, with vast areas of the planet stripped bare by swarm harvesting operations. The survivors would rebuild, but they would never forget the day their world almost died and how humanity had come to their rescue when no one else could help them. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of his newly repaired ship and watched the construction crews working to build humanity's first deep space military base in Zephyrian territory. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Zephyr Prime, and the galaxy was still adjusting to the new reality that humans were now its primary military power. Admiral Patricia Hayes had been promoted to Supreme Allied Commander and was coordinating the hunt for remaining swarm fragments across the galaxy. Intelligence reports indicated that dozens of smaller machine fleets were still active in remote systems, and each one posed a threat to isolated worlds that could not defend themselves. There, Kevin Stone's research teams were working around the clock to understand captured swarm technology, while being careful not to activate any systems that might call other machine fleets to their location. The technological advances they discovered would revolutionize galactic civilization, but they came with warnings about other ancient threats. President Charles Weber addressed the newly formed Galactic Defense Council from Earth and announced the creation of the Terran Defense Compact. Any species willing to adopt human military doctrine and contribute to mutual defense would receive Earth's protection and access to human military technology. The political changes were happening faster than anyone had expected. Species that had considered humans primitive just months ago were now sending delegations to Earth to request military advisors and defense treaties. The old galactic order, based on technological superiority, had collapsed overnight. General Susan Carter established training academies on a dozen worlds where human instructors taught alien military officers the unconventional tactics that had defeated the swarm. The classes were always full as traditional military leaders struggled to understand warfare that ignored honor codes and ancient traditions. Captain Rachel Stone was given command of a joint human-alien task force hunting swarm remnants in the Outer Rim territories. Her ships used the guerrilla tactics developed during the Zephyr Prime battle to track down and destroy machine fleets before they could reorganize and threaten populated systems. The hunt was dangerous work because the remaining swarm fragments had learned from their defeat and were adapting their tactics to counter human strategies. Some machine groups had begun operating independently, making them harder to predict and track through conventional intelligence methods. Dr. Helen Brooks published her research on swarm psychology and adaptation protocols, which became required reading at every military academy in the galaxy. Her work explained how the ancient machines thought and provided guidelines for developing new tactics that could stay ahead of their learning capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy White trained the first generation of mixed-species special forces, units that could operate behind enemy lines against technological superior opponents. Her soldiers came from dozens of different worlds, but they all learned to think and fight like humans when facing impossible odds. Chief Engineer Maria Santos supervised the construction of massive defense platforms at key strategic points throughout known space. The stations were armed with human-designed weapons and staffed by mixed crews that could coordinate responses to threats anywhere in the galaxy. Admiral Vexler became one of humanity's strongest advocates among alien military leaders and worked to overcome resistance from species that still considered human tactics dishonorable. His own transformation from proud warrior to guerrilla fighter helped convince others that survival was more important than tradition. The Zephyrian Republic rebuilt their destroyed worlds, using human engineering techniques that made their new cities more defensible against future attacks. Ambassador Kethville established a permanent embassy on Earth and worked to strengthen the alliance that had saved his people. Captain Steve Johnson took the Ghost Walker on extended reconnaissance missions beyond the edge of known space, searching for signs of other ancient threats that might be awakening. His reports described vast empty regions where entire star clusters had been consumed by unknown forces. Dr. Lisa Grant led research expeditions to worlds that had been attacked by the swarm millions of years ago and found evidence of civilizations that had been completely erased from existence. The discoveries reminded everyone how close the galaxy had come to the same fate. Colonel Frank Turner's integrated combat units became the model for all future military operations as species learned to work together despite fundamental differences in culture and biology. The success of these mixed forces proved that cooperation was essential for galactic survival. Amy Rodriguez was promoted to head of Allied Communications and worked to establish quantum communication networks that could coordinate military responses across the entire galaxy. Her systems allowed rapid deployment of forces to anywhere threats might appear. The first test of the new Galactic defense system came when sensors detected a swarm fragment approaching a remote mining colony. Captain Morrison led the response force and destroyed the machines before they could harvest a single asteroid using tactics that had been refined since. Zephyr Prime President Weber traveled to dozens of worlds to sign defense treaties and establish the legal framework for the new galactic order. Earth had become the center of a military alliance that included almost every surviving civilization, and the responsibility was enormous. Admiral Hayes received reports that some alien governments were concerned about human military dominance and were quietly developing weapons designed to counter human advantages. She knew that humanity's position as galactic protector would not last forever and prepared contingency plans accordingly. The discovery of ancient archives on destroyed worlds revealed that the Void Swarm had been just one of several technological plagues that had swept through the galaxy over millions of years. Other threats were still sleeping in the dark spaces between stars, waiting for something to wake them. Captain Danny Foster established rapid response fleets that could reach any threatened system within days of receiving a distress call. His ships carried the latest human weapons and were staffed by veterans of the Zephyr Prime battle who knew how to fight impossible odds. The economic changes were as dramatic as the military ones, as human technology and tactics became valuable commodities. Throughout the galaxy, Earth's shipyards worked constantly to build vessels for allied species, while human advisors commanded premium prices for their expertise. Dr. Stone's warning about ancient threats proved accurate when deep space sensors detected massive energy signatures moving in the void beyond the galactic rim. Whatever was out there was larger than the swarm fleet had been, and it was heading toward inhabited space. The discovery forced Admiral Hayes to accelerate construction of the galaxy's new defense network while preparing for threats that might make the Void Swarm look small by comparison. Humanity had saved the galaxy once, but the universe was full of ancient evils that were still sleeping. Captain Amy Rodriguez received the first reports of strange signals from the galactic rim. While coordinating routine patrol schedules, the transmissions were unlike anything in the databases, and they seemed to be coming from something that was moving toward known space at incredible speed. Admiral Hayes called an emergency meeting of the Galactic Defense Council to discuss the new threat and coordinate a response. The Alliance fleet was stronger than ever, but intelligence reports suggested they might face something that made their previous victory looked like a minor skirmish. The galaxy had learned to fight like humans when facing extinction, and that knowledge had saved organic civilization from the Void Swarm. Now they would find out if those same tactics could work against whatever ancient horror was approaching from the darkness between the stars. As the first year of the new galactic order ended, humanity found itself in the strange position of being both savior and potential threat to the civilizations it protected. The universe was vast and full of dangers, but at least now there were people willing to fight dirty when fighting clean was not enough to survive.